Hi, this is Maria Morgis. I have a story to share with you about something I learned, or even something I experienced. It was one of those epiphanies, and it happened at a full-day workshop featuring Bob Proctor. As always, Bob was in exceptional form, relaxed, funny, and bang on. Bob brought up some interesting points that day. One in particular that I'd heard many times before, and yet for some reason only on that day did the lesson really sink in. It was a real aha moment for me, and I was so impressed by what I finally understood that I ran home and made some notes, and those are what I'm sharing with you today. Just to give you a visual, this was a weekday event held close by at the Sheridan Parkway in Richmond Hill, Ontario. There were 400 people in attendance, primarily businessmen and businesswomen. It was almost a sea of well-tailored navy suits. Bob flew in the CEO of one of his companies, Life Success Corporate, Sandy Gallagher, to present with him. About an hour before we broke for lunch, Bob introduced Sandy Gallagher and asked her to share her story with us. She started off by telling us how she had attended one of Bob's seminars and become fascinated with the material. Her fascination drove her to study all of his programs, and she soon developed a passion for Bob's work, which then became a healthy obsession. She had a vision of taking some of Bob's material, reworking it, and presenting it in a different format that would benefit and target corporate America. Now, this was a big diversion from her career at the time, as she had a thriving, successful law practice in Seattle. She herself was a very accomplished, brilliant, and highly respected attorney who was considered by her peers to be top in her field, which was bank mergers and acquisitions. Sandy was definitely an overachiever. She certainly was a tremendous success and continues to be, and yet she admitted to being almost paralyzed by fear when she began to contemplate making a career change. She graphically described the feelings of fear that gripped her before she pressed the send button on her computer, which held an email that she was about to send out to 600 recipients, among them her peers, clients, friends, and acquaintances, telling them of her decision to leave her practice and move into a different industry. Now, fear of what her peers were going to think and how her family was going to react, and of course the possibility of failure, almost paralyzed her. She really had come up against a total terror barrier. She knew she had to make a decision, either move forward or be satisfied where she was. She pressed send. Well, I was standing at the back of that room, so I had a great vantage point of the audience, and I could see their reactions to Sandy's story about how incredibly terrified she had felt when she pressed that button. And there was a almost a unison of bodies leaning forward towards that stage and of nodding heads. Clearly, that audience resonated with her fear, and I was one of those people. In fact, at that time, I was a founding partner in a manufacturing facility in the Toronto area, and I too was being pulled to make a career change, and this after 30 years in the same industry. Talk about fear. That scene, however, caused me to look long and hard at the emotion of fear and the role it plays in my life and the lives of many. And I've learned that fear can, to a great extent, be overcome or at the very least be minimized. And to do that, you have to start by understanding it. Most successful people are very familiar with the feeling of fear because they face it all the time. But they will all tell you that fear is never a factor that is to be considered in deciding whether or not they move on an idea. Rarely does anyone reach a high level of success without becoming proficient at facing down fear, and yet no one really questions what that's about or even to what extent it is necessary. Bob calls that the terror barrier for very good reason. He uses the word barrier because that is what stands between us and our goals, or between us and our fears, and more often than not, that terror prevents people from moving forward. I realized that fear was a lesson that needed to come out of the closet because essentially it's a doorway to many breakthrough personal and business successes. And I also knew I had to better understand fear to work with it. It's an emotion that is too often misunderstood, and more often than not, it results in holding people back from any great achievement. I can remember many times when I've stubbornly ignored my fear because I wanted something so badly. So my desire was actually stronger than my fear, which helped me to face it, ignore it, and I just persevered. Looking back, I really didn't think about what I did or what happened, but those were clearly some of the best decisions that I ever made. So if we can agree that fear can be a deal breaker or a fortune breaker, then we should also agree that it's worthy of some introspection. Let's look at the technicalities of fear. Many great men and women before us already have. You know, Franklin D. Roosevelt has a famous quote I'm sure you're familiar with. He said, and I quote, "There is nothing to fear but fear itself." Essentially, he said fear exists only in our mind. Dr. Maxwell Maltz, a highly celebrated plastic surgeon, psychologist, and author of many books, among them Psychocybernetics, described the feeling of fear this way. He wrote, "The fear feeling is a natural temporary response to unfamiliar and uncomfortable instructions you send to your servo mechanism." By this, by the way, he means our conscious mind. But, he goes on to say, you are separate from your fear. You and your fear feeling are not one and the same. You can honestly acknowledge that that you feel fear about doing a particular thing, but then go ahead and do it anyway. And most of the time, the fear feeling will be dissolved by the action. My good friend, playwright, and author Robert Joseph Ahola also writes on the topic of fear by stating, "We are driven by only two emotions, love and fear." That is so profound. He went on to write that our realities of love and fear, the two emotions that drive us as human beings, are self-limiting. Now, I would add to that that these are only self-limiting if we permit them to be through our own ignorance or neglect. If we take the strength of those emotions and use them to drive us towards our goals, we can achieve tremendous things. It's also been noted that if we repeatedly face down fear and refuse to allow it to dictate our decisions, that this practice has the effect of developing our mental capacity and fortitude so that future encounters with this emotion result in a less intimidating and debilitating experience. Let me put this another way. Repeatedly facing fear and not allowing it to dictate our decision and course of actions does have a numbing effect, and over time becomes a more manageable and less intense feeling. So let's take a closer look at fear, what it is and how it develops. If it's not too late, I need to mention that the fear that I'm referring to is not the fear that comes out of the blue along with a shot of adrenaline when we finally or suddenly find ourselves in danger. That fear is not to be ignored. The fear that we create in our minds is the one we need to master. It usually begins as worry, and then the worry turns into doubt. The doubt progresses to anxiety, and finally the anxiety becomes fear. Do you know there are some successful people who claim they never feel fear? And that's because they are great decision makers. They make decisions so quickly that there is no time to ponder and thus no time to go through those stages of worry, doubt, anxiety, and fear. Or, alternatively, it could also be because they have faced fear so often that they have become numb to the emotion. So let's quickly touch on the great decision makers. These people are very productive because they move quickly, they waste no time. Fear may come later, but once their decision has been made and they've committed themselves, then come rain or shine, the show will go on. They avoid the terror barrier by making quick decisions and moving forward so fast that fear really doesn't have a chance to develop. And or if or when it does catch up to them, it's secondary because it's not even something they can afford to entertain since they're already in too deep. Poor decision makers often find themselves free floating in anxiety, which is that uncomfortable emotion that precedes fear. As a result, they tend not to move forward and through that terror barrier, and therefore they do not advance. Remember Roosevelt's words. Fear exists only in our mind. If knowledge is power, then the knowledge of what fear really is should give us the power to overcome and to carry on and pursue whatever it is we desire. Right?